Communication plays an important role in a society. Communication is important for social relationship. Communication brings about mutual understanding. Through communication, we are giving information. We cannot think of a society without communication. So we are going to be discussing in detail different kinds of communication. Verbal communication, non-verbal communication, oral communication, written communication, mediated communication, non-mediated communication, intrapersonal communication, interpersonal communication or face-to-face communication, group communication, mass communication, and interactive communication. We use different kinds of method for different kinds of situations. Communication does not exist in isolation. Depending upon the situation, depending upon the environment, depending upon the need, you go about using different kinds of communication. Let us now try to understand what do we mean by verbal communication. Verbal communication is communicating with words, written or spoken. Verbal communication consists of speaking, listening, writing, reading, and thinking. All of us every day communicate verbally. Verbal communication plays an important role in the communication process. But in verbal communication, you need to know what kind of a language you need to use, what kind of vocabulary you need to use, what kind of a words you need to use. Every word has got a meaning. You should be very clear about the kind and nature of words you are using for communication. You need to be efficient in terms of using a particular language. Here in verbal communication, language plays an important role and you should master that language. Particularly in terms of tourism studies, there are different kinds of people with different kinds of backgrounds, cultural, social, language backgrounds who come. Maybe from India or maybe from abroad. When you are communicating verbally with them, you need to have a good understanding of the language in which you are communicating. Now let us try to look at non-verbal communication. This is again also a major form of communication. Acts speak louder than words. Your actions are important. They're more louder than words. If you raise your eyebrow, which means you express surprise. Eyebrows communicate. Body language plays a very important role in non-verbal communication. Your gestures, your body movements, your facial expression, facial configuration, other movements, your eye contact. Are you speaking in a focused manner by establishing an eye contact with your target audience? The kind of a facial movements or expressions you have. If you are looking at a wristwatch when you are communicating, which means you are in a hurry, you are anxious, you are not interested in communicating with me because you are looking at every 2 seconds or 3 seconds. That is a gesture. So you need to be very, very careful in terms of what kind of a non-verbal methods you are using in terms of communication. You need to pay attention to your body language, the body movement, the kind of a dress you wear, the kind of gestures you have, the kind of an eye contact you are making, the kind of a facial expression you have. Assuming when you are talking to your audience, you smile. You are establishing a rapport. Smile is a non-verbal form of communication. You can use any number of words. You may not be in a position to communicate as effectively, but once you smile at your audience, you are establishing a rapport through your smile. Smile is also a form of communication. So there are several ways we need to go about effectively using non-verbal communication. If you want to effectively communicate non-verbally, look at in what kind of a situation you are communicating. To whom are you communicating? to what kind of a gestures you need to use. The nature of gestures you use for children, the nature of gestures you use for women, the nature of gestures you use for adults vary. Or the nature of gestures used for international audience is different, because gestures mean in different cultures differently. So you need to be very, very careful in terms of non-verbal communication, and you need to know in what kind of a situation you are communicating non-verbally. There are also non-verbal signs and signals. You need to be familiar with what kind of signs, what kind of signals you need to use for communication. Non-verbal messages are received through eye, through ears, through nose. Eyes play an important role in terms of non-verbal communication. Eyes also indicate the moods like fear, anger, anxiety, joy. There are also certain functions of non-verbal communication. Through non-verbal communication, you can repeat through a non-verbal gesture. Through a non-verbal communication, you can substitute. You can complement your information through a non-verbal communication, and you can enhance your communication through a non-verbal sign or signal. In terms of non-verbal communication, someone has to understand your non-verbal communication. As we said, in terms of verbal communication, you need to have a language skill to effectively go about communicating. But in terms of non-verbal communication, we do not have to have that kind of a language skill. But your facial expressions, your gestures, your body language, the way you stand, the way you smile, you go about using your eyes, the way you go about establishing a rapport through your eye contact, you exhibit your confidence. Non-verbal communication is one of the major methods of establishing confidence. Only when you are confident, people are willing to listen to you. That confidence can be exhibited through non-verbal communication means. Now let's talk about another important method of communication, which is called oral communication. Oral communication is an important tool in communication methods. For oral communication, you need to have ability to speak, ability to articulate your ideas and thoughts. Again, in terms of oral communication, you need to have a good understanding of language, of semantics, what kind of words you need to use, how do you go about communicating very effectively through the language becomes very, very important. In oral communication, what is important is the nature of pitch you are using, your intonation, the kind of volume you are using for communication. What is your quality of your voice becomes very important in terms of your communication. To give an example, the pitch can also indicate the mood of the speaker. A speaker can make out in terms of your oral communication how comfortable you are in terms of your speech, because if you raise your pitch level, it's an indication of your mood. Your mood is reflected through indication of your pitch. Oral communication is a very important form of communication. In all cultures, a lot of people communicate orally. Oral communication primarily refers to societies which do not have a script, because there is no written form of communication there. Some of the tribal languages in this country do not have a script. They live in remote areas. They are not literate, but they have a language. They don't have a script. Through that language, they go about communicating. So in terms of oral communication, what is important is your pronunciation and voice modulation. How do we go about pronouncing words? How do you go about modulating your voice is important in oral communication. The oral tradition comes for development of communication because the majority of the rural population in India is illiterate. Oral communication plays an important role because many of them are unfortunately illiterate. They cannot read a script. Written communication does not play any kind of a role there. So you communicate orally. The folk media of India play an important role. The folk media make an extensive use of oral communication. So it's important for you in terms of oral communication, if you want to use it, not only in terms of, you speak, not only you deliver a speech, or not only you communicate with them interpersonal or in a group communication, you can also use the folk media. The folk media in this country are local, they are part of the cultural situation, they are specific to a particular culture, they are indigenous, they are cheaper. We can go about effectively using folk communication for disseminating information in all cultural situations. In every rural area in this country, the folk media are available. The advantage of the folk media is we can establish a rapport with folk media immediately. The folk media are direct. The barriers in folk communication do not exist. So is the case in oral communication. The barriers do not exist because you are directly communicating with the audience and feedback can be instant. You can make out through oral communication whether they have understood the message, whether they have not understood the message. How should you go about communicating with them? Because you are directly communicating with your audience in terms of oral communication. Then we'll get into the next form of communication. The written communication is a very popular form of communication in India. It is growing very, very rapidly as more and more newspapers are coming into the market. More and more people are becoming literate. Many of them read newspapers. Many of them read magazines. There are a lot of articles which are published in newspapers and magazines relating to tourism, relating to travel, relating to major pilgrimage centers. Then that becomes an important type of communication. There are a number of special pages relating to various tourism activities. Tourist guides are also published in newspapers. So written communication plays an important role. The written word is important. But a written word adheres to certain norms. Written communication adheres to grammar. You should again be very, very familiar with how should you go about using language and grammar there. Your sentences should be simple. Your sentences should be clear. The kind of words which you are using should be precise. Because in written communication, when you write, someone is reading somewhere else. He or she is not there to clarify, as in terms of oral communication. The information which is written in newspaper gets multiplied. So that's where you need to pay a great deal of attention to written communication. The kind of language you are using, the nature of words you are using, the kind of sentences you are formulating. Are you clear in formulating those sentences? Do audience understand those words? You need to be very clear in terms of written communication. Written communication is growing and will grow rapidly as more and more people get into schools and colleges and universities. Literacy in this country is growing. So written communication becomes a major form of communication. Then another form of communication is called the mediated communication. Mediated communication is a term which is being increasingly used as a substitute for mass communication. The mediated communication means the contents of a newspaper are gathered, processed and printed by the media organization and reach the reader through a newspaper. In that sense, a newspaper becomes a medium. So that is why it is called mediated communication. Any communication which is going through radio or television through a newspaper. In television, there are reporters who gather information and then they process the information or they edit the information together. They are using a medium for communication there. That becomes a mediated communication. Any communication where we're using any kind of a medium, whether it is newspapers, magazines, radio, television, becomes a mediated communication. And in mediated communication, information gets multiplied instantly. It has a multiplier effect. Mass communication is growing very rapidly in this country for various kinds of developmental activities, where various kinds of tourist activities. We can use newspapers, we can use magazines, we can use radio, we can use television in terms of giving information. Someone can make an excellent documentary talking about a pilgrimage center, and that makes very appealing. That makes, very interesting for the audience. Then in terms of mediated communication, then, we have news agencies, sometimes, advertising. Lot of advertising is there on television. Lot of advertising is there in newspapers. Advertisements give information. That becomes a mediated communication. Then we have another major form of communication, that is non-mediated communication. Conversation is the oldest form of non-mediated verbal communication. It is direct and face-to-face communication. That communication is taking place through a dialogue. There is no technology there. There is no media there. Non-mediated communication is direct. We are using all the time non-mediated communication. A lot of societies use non-mediated communication. There are 4 principal forms of non-mediated communication. 1 is conversation, 2 is interview, 3 is public speaking, and 4 is group communication. In non-mediated communication, we are entering into a conversation with 2 people or 3 people. Or maybe we are interviewing. I am interviewing a person. He is interacting. I am trying to elicit information from who is he, what does he want, what is the nature of information he is looking for. And speaking is another non-mediated form of communication. And then group communication. There is no media there, there is no technology there, we are directly interacting with the people. So, in terms of effective communication, conversation is an important form of communication. Interviewing people is an important form of communication. By speaking to people, we are trying to give information. That's again a non-mediated form of communication. And a group communication is also non-mediated communication. Intrapersonal communication. What do we mean by intrapersonal communication? Intrapersonal communication is individual reflection or thinking or contemplation within oneself. All the time we are thinking within. We are communicating within. That is intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication takes place within a person. Intrapersonal communication is also dreaming, over which we have no control. In intrapersonal communication, very important dimension is the sender and the receiver are the same. I am thinking and I am also receiving the message. That is intrapersonal communication. All the time, we are thinking. We are communicating within ourselves. Intrapersonal communication, the dialogue which takes place within the person is called intrapersonal communication. Now we will discuss another important form of communication, interpersonal or face-to-face communication. Interpersonal communication is direct face-to-face communication between 2 persons is called interpersonal communication. There's a dialogue between 2 people, or there's a conversation between 2 people without any intervention. There is no technology there, any other kind of a medium there. We are both of us interacting. We are talking face to face. So interpersonal communication is direct, it is intimate, it is personal, allowing for maximum interaction, exchange of communication. Interpersonal communication, verbally, someone trying to communicate, or maybe non-verbal gestures, non-verbal means someone is adopting, that also communicates. There are several stages which are there in terms of how interpersonal communication takes place. The first is the fatigue stage. The initial exploratory stage of communication determines the course of conversation will take place. It begins with hi, hello, how are you, good morning, or good evening. In other words, you are trying to establish a rapport. There is a warming up between individuals. When I say good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, I'm trying to establish a relationship. You respond to what I'm saying. So that's an important stage in terms of interpersonal communication. When I greet people, if they greet back, then some kind of communication is taking place there. If, of course, someone does not greet, then I can make out, that particular person is not interested in talking to me. The second interpersonal communication is the personal stage. The personal stage introduces a more personal element into conversation. We enter into a dialogue. By entering into a dialogue, we exchange some information. That's the personal stage. And then, there is something called the intimate stage. The stage is reserved for friends and relatives. The degree of intimacy depending upon the closeness of the relationship. The way you communicate with your friends is different. The way you communicate with your children is different. The way you communicate with your wife is different. So there are three stages very important in terms of interpersonal communication: the fatigue stage, the personal stage, and the intimate stage. Now let us get into another form of communication which is important again, is group communication. Group communication is you're communicating with a group of people, maybe 5, maybe 10. Again, in group communication, you need to know what is the group you're communicating with. Who are they in the group? What is their background of that particular group? Sometimes, when you are communicating in a classroom with a group of students, you need to know your students. What is their level? What is their background? And you go about communicating with the group with that understanding. In group communication, the kind of level you want to communicate, intellectually, academically, at what kind of a level you need to go about communicating with the people becomes important. In interpersonal communication, you have an idea about with whom you are communicating. But in terms of group communication, you can have more than 5 people, more than 10 people. So that's where you need to be very, very careful when you are communicating in a group. What kind of a language background they come from? They may be from South India, they may be from North India. So you need to understand their background.